इंडिया स्पीक्स डेली को सब्सक्राइब करें, उसके बेल आइकन को ज़रूर दबाएं यदि आपको इसकी पत्रकारिता पसंद हो। धन्यवाद।
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to India Speaks Daily. As India is all set to welcome the US President Donald Trump on a state visit, speculations are rife as to whether this would lead to any concrete solutions to issues of long-standing dispute between India and the US, whether this would actually lead to any concrete outcomes in terms of solving various long-standing controversial issues between the two countries. Because this is not the best of the times for relationship between the India and the US. The relationship between the two countries has been quite strained, to be honest, in the light of the recent remarks made by the US President Donald Trump over his supposed offer to mediate on the Kashmir issue. And Donald Trump has been adopting a flip-flop policy on the Kashmir issue consistently. And apart from that, on the trade front too, America has been behaving in a way that's been quite inimical to India's interests. America, under the leadership of President Donald Trump, through its America First approach, has taken a lot of decisions that have negatively impacted the Indian trade industry. So in the light of all these things, the expectations are rife. There are a lot of expectations from the visit, and in all, at least 5 pacts concerning homeland, security, trade facilitation, and intellectual property rights are expected to be signed during this visit. Now, I think that, however, it would be too ambitious to expect this visit to be some sort of a game changer in the context of India-US relationship, in the context of the long-standing issues between the India and the US, be it the issue of sanctions on Iranian oil import, something which has already impacted India majorly, with India's oil bills shooting up as it is forced to look for alternatives, or be it the issue of US excluding India from the preferential trade agreement, something which it had done last year, again inimical to India's business interests, India's trade interests, or be it the recent classification of India as a developed country by the US in the list which it uses to sort of undertake its business transactions. Now this again is a huge blow to India, because then the US will treat India as a developed country, and then it would not sort of consider India for any sort of exemption from trade tariffs and trade concessions. And this is something something that the US has been consistently doing in WTO. The US has been trying to attack India and China as well as other developing countries for supposedly misusing, for taking too much advantage of their developing country status by taking too much benefits by way of trade subsidies and by way of various exemptions. Now, so the US has been sort of playing this game, and the US has been consistently doing this at WTO. So the US, let's be clear, has been consistently trying to make wrong use of its power. It has been trying to make wrong use of its global hegemony. And when it comes to India's long-term trade interests, India's long-term business interests, the US has been trying to make unethical use of its global importance, and it has been trying to bully developing countries towards accepting unequal terms and conditions. So when it comes to India's long-term business interests or trade interests, let's be clear about one thing, that the US President Donald Trump in the White House is no friend of India. No matter what he says in front of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, no matter what kind of camaraderie he displays and all the sweet talk he does, when it would actually comes to taking decisions, then he takes very tough and ruthless decisions, putting the US first. And then when he does that, when he finally announces his decisions, then he doesn't mind trampling on the interests of any other countries, including India. So while negotiating with the US, while making negotiations with the US, India has to be very, very careful of these things, and India has to be very careful while doing these trade negotiations not to make any compromises, not to compromise its own interests, because if it falls into the compromise trap, thinking it would somehow benefit, then things could get only worse from there. Now, with the US presidential elections due to be held sometime later this year, the whole the visit by US President Donald Trump is also for him a part of his campaigning strategy, as much as it is, of course, an opportunity to talk with India, to engage with India. So for the president, for the US president, this is very much of a campaigning strategy, an opportunity to campaign in front of the world, keeping in mind the Indian American diaspora, whom he sees as a viable voter base in the upcoming US presidential elections. So of course the US president right now in India, when he comes to India, will say all the right kind of things, make all the right kind of noises. As I said, his eyes are ultimately on the US presidential elections, with the Indian America diaspora being a decisive factor in the outcome of those elections. So we don't, India has to be cautious about the fact that it should not be taken in by President Donald Trump's chimera, by the Trump chimera, by the sweet talk of US President Donald Trump, because any drastic sort of outcome, any drastic change in the trajectory of India-US relationships can only take place once the new president assumes office, be it Donald Trump or whoever else it might be after the elections. Till then, it is just a matter of goodwill and creating a conducive environment for future talks to take place. So India should not really have too much hopes from this meeting, from the visit of the US President Donald Trump, from the perspective of any outcomes actually, any concrete outcomes actually coming. So, of course, India should definitely lay out a red carpet welcome to the US President when he visits, which it is already planning to do, because let's not forget, the global hegemony of power is tilted towards the US, and the entire global financial system, all the trade systems are completely dependent on the dollar, and as of now the world hasn't been able to find an alternative to the dollar. The world hasn't been able to forge an alternative front to the Chinese, to the US economic system, to the US dollar. China tried to do this in its own way, but then again China, because of its narrow interest, it was not taking other countries along with it. It was consistently defined the WTO, consistently defined the international trade norms. So China also fell prey to the ever-growing importance, ever-growing hegemony of the US dollar. So in such circumstances, it is imperative for any country, including India, to keep the US in its good books, to keep the US somewhat entertained. But at the same time, and as India has always done that, India has to be polite but firm in making it clear to the US that it's not going to compromise the interests of its local industry. It's not going to compromise the interests of its exports, of its local indigenous industries in order to entertain the US. And which is why India has to continue its unwavering commitment to India first by continuing to be stringent about the entry of the US dairy products in India the way US wants so, because there's a big indigenous dairy industry in India, and which employs millions of workers, and the government is investing so much into the agro processing industries as well. So this kind of move, if the US dairy products get this kind of unequal, this kind of very overarching access into the Indian market, then definitely the Indian dairy industry and its workers will suffer. So India should definitely continue its clear stand on that front. So India has to keep the interests of domestic industry, domestic manufacturing at the forefront, while conceding to any demands from the US side. And also, last but not the least, India has to politely but very firmly make it clear to the US President Donald Trump that India doesn't need his expertise on addressing the Kashmir issue.